Have you seen my beach ball spout?
You're on video, by the way.
Day 1. We left the airport on an average shuttle bus. This basic little bus was to be our last comfort for the next 10 days. We were driven through the outskirts of Port Moresby to a yard where our porters were waiting to meet us. Greetings aside, we sorted our packs and headed off into 2 trucks. As we drove through Port Moresby's outer suburbs, passing the ragtag houses where many nationals lived and the occasional rough-built shop, it reminded me so much of Africa. There really was not much difference. On our way to Owa's Corner, we visited the Bomana War Cemetery, the final resting place of those who gave their lives on the track. Bomana's sacred soil nurtures the spirits of some of Australia's finest sons. In ordered, silent rows lie the men who laid down their lives defending their homeland. There are 3,823 burial sites at Bomana, 700 of them unknown. The number of graves here is truly daunting. So many lives lost in such cruel and brutal battles. From here, we rode in an open truck about 60 kilometres to Owa's Corner, where the trek began. Teamed up with our porters for the first time, we made the descent from Owa's Corner to the Goldie River. This was short but steep, and the group was in high spirits as we followed our porters, who were quickly to become our trusted friends. The first hour or so was not too bad, although very hot in the full sun. I'm so glad I trained in these boots to wear them in. It is here also I learnt that apart from my water, my walking stick will be my next valued possession. Upon reaching the very fast-flowing Goldie River, it was boots off and packs to our porters as we waded knee-deep to cross our first river crossing. After a series of small creek crossings, we arrived at Goodwater near Dump 66, where we set up camp for the night. Brett and I were the only 2 to bring our tents. All the others bunked down on mattresses with mosquito nets in a guest house, a basic shelter made from bamboo with a floor and a roof. Fortunately, our porters set up our tents so it wasn't too hard to make a nice comfortable nest after such a hard first day. Dinner, followed by a nice cuppa, and we were tucked in by 7:30. Day 2. An early start today to make our way over the saddle of Imitar Ridge, up the infamous Golden Staircase. The Australian engineers dug a wooden stairs into the hillside to make the initial climb. Unfortunately for us, the stairs have since rotted away. Under the dense rainforest canopy, the very steep 400-metre climb of Imitar Ridge took us about 2 hours of hard climbing. The descent was as steep as the climb, and for the first time our legs really felt the pressure of the downhill slope. Our bodies were well and truly in survival mode. I'm starting to learn very quickly now that after we have climbed up, we will always climb down, and for me, the up wasn't the problem. 2.5 hours later, we descended into and up the Aole Creek, crossing the creek more than 20 times through the beautiful rainforest, shallow rapids, waterfalls and tranquil pools. We stopped for lunch of one of the Papuans' versions of mee goreng at one of these nice cool pools, where we were able to soak our feet and fill up our water, which we had to treat with tablets to make it drinkable. From here we made our way up, and more up for another 2 hours to our next campsite at Irabara village. This was the only campsite on the track that we shared with other trekkers, but whilst enjoying a nice hot cup of sweet tea, we were the only group to be treated to an amazing Papuan dance by our very own porters before watching an amazing sunset over the ridge. After a dinner of, I'm not sure what it was, but we ate it, we were again entertained by our porters, known as the famous Buna Boys, and they are quite famous on the track for their singing and entertainment. Where they got their energy from, I will never know. Again, an early night, for me at least. Brett's airbed had a blowout the night before and he was now doing it really tough. Good night all. Day 3. Our porter's energetic version of the war cry, or the haka, we started another steep climb to Irabara Ridge. Along the way, we dropped our packs and detoured off the track to see some Australian trenches and hear how the Australians lay low here in these dugouts, just waiting for the advancing Japanese. In front of one of these trenches, one of our troopers, Paddy, read a poem written by an Australian sapper, Bert Barros, about the unidentified soldier, WX Unknown, who they buried on Irabao Ridge. This was the first of many emotional readings we did throughout the entire track. Off again, up to the top of Irabao Ridge, a series of false peaks with small plateaus after small plateaus convinced us we will finally reach the top before revealing yet another testing climb. We also visited a Japanese camp on our way to the next campsite at Nauru village. The wash point here was a challenge in itself because it is as good as a descent as anything we've endured today.
He came from the Western State, though to us he remained unknown, for the WX was marked in his hat, the rest a mortar had blown. We buried him there on the mountain spur, where the trees were draped in moss. We thought of his mother, no news for her of that irreplaceable loss. Just a boy he looked, with his snowy hair, as we laid him down in the clay. The Padre's voice was low and clear, no others had words to say. Yet we knew a mother would watch and wait for a letter sent by her boy. How she would dream of the things he did, how his first words caused her joy. And as he went off to school or game, he waved her fond goodbyes, just as he did when the great call came, and the hot tears hurt her eyes. Perhaps she will know in some unknown way of that little rugged cross that remains of her hero beneath it lay, where the trees are draped in moss. We curse the foe who stripped the dead. No pity on them can be shown. We marked his cross so it can be read, WX Unknown.
Day 4. Before heading off this morning, I looked back at the Magoolis, silently congratulating myself for this achievement so far. The track this morning is quite level through swampy ground with a series of stagnant pools which we crossed on unstable logs. We plodded on through the mud until we came to the Brown River. With boots off and packs down, we crossed the extremely fast-flowing river holding onto a rope, and for me, porters helping me so I didn't get swept downstream, where there were at least 4 porters in different locations in case someone did come off. After topping up with water, we began the grinding climb of the wall. After nearly 2 hours of vertical scrambling, we rested briefly on a small clearing known as Nauru Saddle before the steep downhill struggle to our campsite at Manari village, where after lunch of cheese, salami and crackers and a cup of hot sweet tea, we ventured into the village to have a look around. This reprieve from walking was such a relief to me. After a wonderful relaxing bath in the river, I had time to treat my poor feet, which were starting to become a bit of a problem and really starting to feel the effects of our journey. Thanks to some amazing bandages from 2 trekkers in our group that were paramedics, I never had another problem with my feet again. It was nice to have a bit of R&R and enough time to air out our manky clothes, listening to some Kenny Rogers and such, while Dave and Brett played war games with some old guns they found near the guest house. All in all, a lovely, well-earned rest, dinner and an early night before a planned 5 a.m. start. Day 5. Up and at 'em this morning. No time for stragglers as we don our headlights to face a downhill struggle in the darkness to another river crossing. This was quite a long crossing of 2 pieces of bamboo high above white water. It was here, this very slow crossing, that I conquered my fear of bamboo crossings. I am woman, hear me roar. Well, it wasn't quite like that, but from here we faced a massive climb of 4.5 hours straight up, and more up to the top of Brigade Hill. Here we have a 360-degree view of the most beautiful and panoramic country along the track, and also one of the most sacred locations. It was here the Australians, who were outnumbered by at least 6-1, fought in one of the epic battles of the Kokoda campaign. Here we learned from the emotional readings of 3 of the members in our group how the diggers felt as they waited for the inevitable onslaught. When the 2nd 27th Battalion arrived, they were exposed to the full on attack of Mission Ridge below us, and the 22nd and 14th and the 2nd to 16th dug in on the ground where we were standing. The tears and the silence of our small group of trekkers as we stood together in front of the 62 wooden stakes that represented the 62 Aussies who died on this hill were truly heartfelt. Learning of the courage and sacrifice of the Australian soldiers, hearing the letters from their grieving mothers, listening to the recital of the ode and the haunting sound of the last post from the lone bugle, for me was very, very emotional journey, and one I will never forget. After a late breakfast of tasty bush damper and a cup of tea, we started the descent past Mission Ridge to a fogey. Just after we left the clearing, we came to the remnants of a hollow tree. It was in this tree that a Japanese corporal, who earned the name as the Bone Collector, hid for 3 days while all his men died around him in battle. He vowed to make sure every one of his soldiers were taken home, and he spent the next 43 years collecting their remains and taking them back to Japan. After walking through the dense jungle canopy, we came out to open grasslands, and from here it was past Mission Ridge, then to the village of Fogey. With no trees to protect us from the fierce sun above, we could feel the steamy heat rising from the grass. It wasn't too hard to imagine how the tough South Australian soldiers of the 2nd 27th Battalion endured this open position with its very limited water supply, as they dug in and then fought. We then headed past the airstrip through a Fogey 1 to a lovely creek to top up our water before an extremely hard, hot and sweaty climb under the scorching sun to a Fogey 2. After lunch, we followed the track down through a series of small creeks using the small logs for crossings, and at one stage we were almost directly under a 10-metre waterfall. Then we had a lot more steep climbing to get to Nadori village, where we're spending the night. Day 6. This morning we walked through the small village to visit Avuru Ndiki, the last remaining Fuzzy Wuzzy angel. We were greeted by his grandson, who talked to us about the life of this amazing man. We were told he was 110 years old, but in reality we think he'd be 90-something. Listening to the stories of the roles the Fuzzy Wuzzies played during the Kokoda campaign, how they tirelessly carted the stretchers, carrying the wounded along the track, enduring things no others could. For me, this was a very humbling experience and such an honour for this very proud Australian to say thank you to the last angel. From Nadori, the track rises up, and more up in a series of very steep inclines with no protection from the sun. After we reached the grassland for a brief rest, I couldn't help but think about how the diggers must have felt when they were with all they were enduring. This climb quickly zapped our energy. I was sweating like I'd never sweated before. Next we had to, you can guess it, more steep climbing. After another hour or so, the track headed back down under the tree canopy, making life a little easier. Soon we were on the crest of the ridge, enjoying the magnificent views of Nadori and Fogey from where we had just come. Then on to Diggers Rest for lunch and a quick dip in the creek before filling up our water supplies. Nothing felt as good as the cold water on the tired, aching body. Especially my knee at this point was really feeling the pressure. For the next 2 hours, we walked through the beautiful rainforest, cool and level, surrounded by giant pandanus trees and huge tree ferns as we made our way to Lake Myola. This is a bowl-shaped depression full of open grassland and reeds. Myola was used during the war as a drop zone, dropping supplies and ammunition to the Australian troops. From here, we walked back to the track via a mortar dump and the crash site of a B-25 Mitchell bomber. On again for about an hour before we came to a small log bridge crossing, stopping to fill with water before the 2.5 hours climb to the top of Mount Bellamy at 2,200 metres. This was the highest peak of the track. But it wasn't until 1 hour later, when we came to a clearing on the northern slope, that we actually realised the height we had reached. From this point, we were able to see on the far horizon Kokoda, our destination, and we were looking through the true span of Kokoda Gap, the gap that the High Command ordered the diggers to blow up to try to slow the advancing Japanese. From the gap, in an uncontrollable drizzle, it was slow, slippery trudge downhill through the heavy, cloying, foul-smelling mud. It is hard to imagine what these young men endured for our freedom, but today's journey gave me some clues. Many trekkers had passed here today heading the opposite way and telling us of the wet conditions we were about to face. This was undoubtedly the hardest part of the trek for me. I was freezing as the coolness of the canopy was freezing my sweat-soaked clothes. At times I was shaking uncontrollably. When I tried to avoid the masses of the sludge, only to sink further, sometimes getting quite bogged and then slipping out of control. Getting out was not easy, and at one time I thought my porter might end up sinking with me. After that, I followed close behind my porter, quickly tracing his steps before they filled up again. It was nearly dark by the time we rolled into camp at Templeton's 1. Thankfully, another porter had gone ahead and set up my tent. Unfortunately for the others, their camp for the night was a tarp that did not look very waterproof at all. This night, there was no river to wash the mud off. Even if there was, it would have been way too cold. So I sat by the fire until my mud had set and scraped it off with my knife. Dinner tonight was a quiet affair, with a few of our group wondering how much sleep they would get under that tarp. With a few trekkers sliding down on the way, I think we were all too tired to care. Smelly and muddy I may have been, but once inside my warm, waterproof tent, it took me no time at all to fall asleep. Day 7. This morning, after a gentle 2.5 hour walk, we came to Templeton's Crossing 2, a beautiful campsite on the banks of Aora Creek. Here, the beautiful, clean, cold mountain water creek divides itself into a series of small natural spas with smooth boulders. After leaving Templeton's 2, we followed the creek downstream for a while before another steep climb of about 2 hours to the top of the ridge. After a rest and a bit of first aid for my knee from one of the paramedics, we set off again. Rested and repaired, we began our descent to the location of the wartime Aora Creek village, where we would camp for the night beside the raging Aora Creek and the beautiful waterfalls. Along the way, keeping our eyes peeled for a series of weapon pits that lined the track, marking the Australian defensive positions at the time. This is a significant place where the Australians set up an aid post to treat casualties from the Battle of Insarava in late August 1942. Later it became a place of carnage, a bloody battle as the Australians pursued the Japanese in October 1942. The fighting here was savage.
I don't have a partner. Sometimes I feel like my only friend is the city I live in, the city of angels. Lonely as I am, together we cry. I drive on the streets 'cause she's my companion. I walk through the hills 'cause she knows who I am. She sees my good deeds and she kisses the windy. And I never worry, now that is a lie. I don't ever wanna feel like I did that day. Take me to the place I love, take me all the way. I don't ever wanna feel like I did that day. Take me to the place I love, take me all the
Hey,
way.
Fiona. Fiona, don't be nervous. I do have a video operating.
It's hard to believe that there's nobody out there. It's hard to believe that I'm all alone. At least I have her love. The city, she loves me. Lonely as I am, together we cry. I don't ever wanna feel like I did that day. Take me to the place I love, take me all the way. I don't ever wanna feel like I did that day. Take me to the place I love, take me all the way.
Are you beauty? Beauty. Manky. Yeah, I can spell everybody else's name, but I'm trying to step in.
Day 8. After a nice sleep in, we were all in good spirits and ready for another hard day ahead. First, we had to cross the Aurora Creek on a bridge made from jungle vines tied around trees. The construction of this bridge was amazing, all woven together and nothing to make it stable, but strong enough that it didn't swing much. Anyway, I'm over that fear now, so for me it was a cruise in the park. Next, we climbed up to the location of the Japanese gun position, complete with rusting munitions, mortars, grenades and much more, had the boys intrigued. We had a commanding view of the Australian position at the wartime village of Aurora Creek. From here, we can see where the Japanese fired upon the Australians with mountain guns, heavy machine guns and mortars before they were outflanked by a surprise Australian attack on a high ground. This location is part of the recently discovered Lost Battleground. For me, this was the most traumatic place on the whole track. The eerie feelings imprinted in my mind will be very hard to remove. It was only when we climbed back down to the track that I was told that most Papuans refused to go up there because of the haunting spirits. Occasionally, I still feel or see those haunting spirits. Sliding down again, crisscrossing the rivers until we passed through Aola village, we went past Surgeon's Rock, a huge slab of granite that was used by one of the medical officers to carry an emergency operation on one of the wounded during the withdrawal from Insaraba. By now, my poor knee was screaming with all the savage descents. After a quick rest, it was another 3 hours of extreme uphill climbing to reach our next campsite at Insaraba for a late lunch and no more walking for today. The location had a nice campsite with amazing views of Insaraba Memorial, which overlooks the mountains and the clouds way below us. After a shower, we strolled down to the memorial and read the plaques about the battles that took place there and some of the heroes of that battle. On returning to the camp, we were treated to another dance by our porters. I think it must have been a rain dance, because while we were enjoying a nice cup of tea, just before dinner the skies opened and the rain came down hard and fast. After a dinner of lentil stew, not a huge hit, but hot and edible, it was time to make a mad dash up a very muddy, very slippery slope to my tent, which by now has an almost dangerous smell. As I lay there listening to the remaining rain pelting down on my tent, I prayed I wouldn't have to get up through the night to use the toilet that was down that very muddy, very slippery slope. Day 9. Today we were awake early to make our way in the darkness past the Insaraba Memorial to Kingsbury's Rock. Here, a member of our group read about Bruce Kingsbury, the only Victoria Cross winner of the whole Kokoda campaign, who met his death in an amazing act of heroism. The story of Kingsbury and his mates are remembered in the series of photographic plaques that are part of the memorial site. Next, we made our way up to the memorial where it was my turn to do a reading. My reading was from a plaque inside the memorial honouring the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels. Firstly, Staffy, one of our porters, read the plaque in the local tongue, and then I read it in English, stopping occasionally to compose myself. After this, we silently made our way in single form with our porters around the inner circle of the memorial until we were evenly spaced to listen for the last time as one of our group recited the ode, and then the haunting sound of the lone bugle playing the last post. We were paying our respects to those who had died here in the 4-day battle of Insaraba. Just as the sun began to creep up over the mountains, we joined the silence around us, getting lost in our own thoughts. Breakfast as usual, and then after packing up, we made our way all the way down the almost vertical track through the old Daninki village site to Hoi village, where we had another enjoyable afternoon relaxing alongside a beautiful stream and celebrated the end of the mountains. This was to be our last night with some of our porters, as some were going back home to the outskirts of Buna village and some were going on to join another trek. While we were relaxing, Woody, one of the 2 head porters, ran 20 kilometres into Kokoda to buy 6 fresh chickens that our porters prepared in a Papuan-style hangi. Different from the Kiwis, as the Papuan hangi was above the ground. Tonight was to be a celebration night, and our personal porters, not the usual camp cooking porters, were laying on a feast. We were escorted to the dinner shelter to find the table had been beautifully decorated with flowers and leaves, and our feast awaited us. Chicken, the first meat in 10 days that didn't come from a can or packet. Corn, rice, fried okra vines, cassava and fried green bananas. Next, our porters, the famous Buna boys, entertained us. These boys have amazing voices and sing in beautiful harmony. We had been advised that we had to come up with a nickname for our porters, and they, one for us. My porter's name was Robin, so I named him Hoodie after Robin Hood, the Knight of the Forest. Robin named me Smiling Pixie because he said every time he looked back I was smiling. I think he got that confused with frustrated. This is really hard kind of look. Then he presented me with a stick that he carved at night time along the track. Robin was an amazing porter and I'm eternally grateful for his support throughout the trek. Some speeches and singing and dancing finally brought this wonderful evening to a close. That night, lying in my tent, I had an immense feeling of satisfaction, knowing that in at least 4 more hours trekking tomorrow, we will arrive in Kokoda. I will have lived my dream. Day 10. Today it was breakfast as usual, except it was our last breakfast on the track. With everyone in fine spirits, we made our last triumphant lap towards Kokoda. With a little drizzle in the air, we prepared ourselves with ponchos and backpack covers as we powered through the fields of choco vines and kuna grass, through the small settlement of Koveli onto the final stage. With the rain getting a little heavier, it felt as if this was the track's last test for us. This deceptively long walk through the steaming flat lands and on to the palm plantations on the outskirts of Kokoda seemed to take forever. Are we there yet? Are we there yet? We made our final walk up the Kokoda plateau and through the arches to the trucks waiting to take us on the northern beaches. No rain, mud or exhaustion could ruin this moment. We are there. We travelled the bumpy roads in the back of the trucks until we were told that the roads were impassable due to heavy rains and the trucks could not make it through. So it was back on the road we walked. 4 more miles, stopping at a museum on the way where there were quite a few relics as well as overgrown Japanese bunkers. Packs on again for the last leg into the beautiful coastal village of Buna. As we strolled through the coconut palms of the villages to the magnificent tribal welcome greeting us, singing and dancing to us in the heart of their village, where we were greeted to a fresh, tasty coconut. I felt like I was in heaven. For the first time, I slept in a guest house. This wasn't any old guest house. This was like the Hilton. Well, maybe not quite, but that's exactly how it felt. After an amazing swim in the ocean and a bucket wash, we settled into the dining area, overlooking the beautiful beach to eat dinner, followed by a nice cup of tea before retiring for the night. Day 11. After breakfast, we left Buna and walked along the beach, which is named Maggot Beach. Meeting up with a few of our porters' families along the way, it was on this beach that the Kokoda campaign ended in early 1943. In the sweltering sun, we walked inland, crossing a small river to a lovely village of Fanananda for lunch. The chief of the village is also the owner of the small accommodations and the restaurant there, and served us with the best lunch we've had since leaving Cairns. We also visited the local museum, another plus for the boys. More walking on the beach to a boat that took us to Gona and our last night at Saroda. When we arrived, another amazing greeting led us into the large Christian village with some dancing and singing and the never-ending chant of Oro, 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 which means welcome. By this time we'd had quite enough, and after a beautiful swim in the ocean and a dinner, a few of us lay on the grass and enjoyed a couple of beers that had magically appeared after Dave subtly, or otherwise, announced we really needed a beer. Lying under the starlight night with a cold beer was magic. trying to sleep, listening to the constant howling of dogs and locals fighting all night was not. Again, many thanks to my tent and earplugs, I was a happy camper indeed. Day 12. After a relaxing morning, which included another dip in the ocean, we dressed in our finest. Our finest at this stage was the clothes that had the least smell, to walk the last 100 metres to the truck where the truck would be waiting, or so we thought. We said our farewells to the villagers and started to make our way to the truck when we were told the road was impassable and the truck had to wait down the road. What they really meant was we had to walk another 4 kilometres, firstly through some swamps, then out in the open under the scorching sun. And by the way, we have a plane to catch, so hurry up. When we finally met the truck, we all scrambled in before we were left behind. Travelling flat out, seated on the boards of a truck on the rough, bumpy, outback roads in PNG was not an experience I'd care to repeat. We made it to the airport in Popondetta with plenty of time to spare and boarded the plane to Port Moresby, where we then boarded a boat to Lalata Island, where we spent our last night together. On this small island, away from the dangers of Port Moresby, and after an amazing, long, luxurious hot shower, we gathered together to enjoy many well-earned drinks and reflect on our journey together. Until recently, very few Aussies had heard of the battles of Kokoda in Sarava, Brigade Hill, Mission Ridge, Templeton's Crossing, Irabawa, Gona, Buna and Sanananda, which in 1942 saved Papua New Guinea and the Australians from the Japanese domination. Yet the heroes of these battles, such as Bruce Kingsbury, Charlie McCallum and many others, are virtually unknown to those who now enjoy the legacy and prosperity in a free land. I was awed by the enormity of the ordeals endured by the young diggers who fought so hard along this tiny path. My appreciation grew enormously as I retraced the steps, and I felt the aura of the spirits of young men who never returned home. Today it is hard to imagine what these young men endured for our freedom, lest we forget.